The envelope had been sitting on the kitchen counter for 3 days before my mother-in-law finally asked me about it. I hadn't opened it yet. I knew what was inside. I'd been expecting it for months, but I wasn't ready. Not because I was afraid of what it said, but because once I opened it, everything would become real. There'd be no more telling myself it might still work out. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and set it back down without touching the seal. My mother-in-law, Margaret, watched me from the doorway. She didn't say anything at first. She just refilled her coffee and sat down at the table like she had somewhere to be, which she didn't. Margaret always made herself comfortable in my home. That had been the arrangement since the day her son and I got married. She lived 40 minutes away in Barrie, but she spent so much time at our place in Oakville that she might as well have had her own room. Some days I didn't mind, most days I did. "You should open it," she said. "I know. It's not going to change what's in it. I know that too." She wrapped both hands around her mug and stared at me in that way she had. Not unkind, exactly, but measuring. Like she was calculating something. "David said you've been difficult about the whole thing." I looked up from the envelope. "David says a lot of things." She made a small sound in the back of her throat, not quite a laugh. "He's still your husband." "For now," I said. "Before I get into it, tell me in the comments. What's the worst thing a family member has ever taken from you without asking?" I met David Calloway when I was 24, and he was 31. He was charming in the way that men who grew up with money can be. Easy and confident, like the world had never given him a reason to doubt himself. I found that attractive back then. I thought it meant he was stable. I didn't understand yet that there's a difference between confidence and entitlement, and that the gap between those two things can swallow a marriage whole. We got together fast and married faster. I was 26 when we had the wedding at a vineyard outside of Niagara-on-the-Lake. His parents paid for most of it, and Margaret made sure everyone knew that. She gave a speech at the reception that spent 4 minutes talking about the Calloway family history, and about 45 seconds acknowledging me. My own mother squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "Just smile." I smiled. For the first few years things were fine. Not perfect, but fine. We bought the house in Oakville together, a 4-bedroom detached on a quiet crescent, close to the lake. I'd been working as a project manager at a mid-size construction firm since before we got married, and, by the time we bought the house, I was making good money. Not Calloway money, but real solid money that I'd earned without anyone's help. I put in 40% of the down payment. David put in 60, a chunk of which came from a gift from his parents. The house was in both our names. That was the agreement. That was always the agreement. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until 3.5 years into the marriage, was that David had gone back to his parents for a second loan 18 months after we bought the place. A private loan, documented between family, secured against the property without my knowledge or consent. His parents had co-signed something I'd never been asked to sign. He'd had a lawyer draw it up quietly while I was traveling for work. I found out by accident. I was looking for the home insurance documents in his desk drawer, and I found the paperwork instead. I sat on the floor of his home office for 20 minutes, just reading it over and over, trying to understand what I was looking at. When I asked him about it, he said it wasn't a big deal. He said it was just a formality. He said his parents had just wanted some security because they'd already given us so much. "They gave you so much," I said. He looked at me like I was being difficult. That was the beginning of the end, though I didn't admit it to myself for another year. I kept trying. I went to couples counseling, first alone and then eventually with him. I asked for transparency. I asked to be included in financial decisions. I asked, more times than I can count, to feel like an equal partner in my own marriage and my own home. David would agree, and then things would slowly drift back to the way they'd been before, and I'd find myself in the same conversation 3 months later, slightly more tired than the last time. The Calloways had opinions about everything, about how the house should be decorated, about where we should spend Christmas, about whether we should have children yet. Margaret brought this up at least twice a year, always phrased as a gentle suggestion, always landing like a demand. David's father, Robert, was a retired real estate developer who still acted like he was running a company. He talked to David about the property constantly, the value of the neighborhood, what renovations would increase resale, whether we should refinance. He never talked to me about any of it directly. He talked around me. I started noticing things. The way Robert would address David exclusively, when the 4 of us were together, even when I'd ask the question. The way Margaret would offer to help around the house, in a way that felt more like inspection than generosity. The way David, Whenever I pushed back on anything related to his family, would go quiet and then distant, and I'd spend days trying to recover the warmth between us before I'd finally let it go. I let a lot go. And then, 14 months ago, David told me he wanted to separate. He said he'd been unhappy for a long time. He said he felt like we wanted different things. He said it in the kitchen, on a Tuesday evening, while I was making pasta, and his voice was so calm that for a second I thought I'd misheard him. I turned off the stove. I sat down. We talked for 3 hours, and by the end of it I understood that he'd been mentally checked out of the marriage for at least 2 years while I'd been trying to save it. What came next was 12 months of the most exhausting experience of my life. The separation agreement negotiations dragged on and on. David got a lawyer immediately, one of Robert's old contacts, someone who'd handled Calloway family business for years. I got my own lawyer, a woman named Patricia who came recommended by a colleague, and who turned out to be the most valuable person in my life during that entire period. Patricia was the one who first flagged the issue with the secondary loan. She was the one who explained to me what it meant, and what it didn't mean. She was the one who helped me understand that despite what the Calloways seemed to believe, I had rights. They're going to try to make this complicated, Patricia told me, about 6 months in. They have resources and they're not afraid to use them. I know, I said. The question is whether you want to fight, or whether you want to settle. I thought about the 4 years of trying, the counseling sessions, the conversations that ended with me apologizing for being too sensitive, the loan I never knew about, the speech at my own wedding. I want what I'm owed, I said. Nothing more, nothing less. The envelope on the counter was the final separation agreement. Patricia had sent it over after the last round of negotiations, which had gone better than expected. David had backed down on several things he'd originally fought hard for. I think his own lawyer had finally told him his position wasn't going to hold up. The loan issue had been the turning point. When Patricia brought it to the table formally, with documentation, it changed the entire tone of the conversation. I opened the envelope on a Thursday morning, after Margaret had gone home. I made myself a cup of tea first, English breakfast, no sugar, which is the one thing I've been consistent about my entire adult life. And I sat down at the kitchen table in the quiet of my own house and I read every page. The house would be sold. That had been agreed to weeks ago. Neither of us could buy out the other's share without it getting messy, and honestly, I didn't want to stay. Too many rooms that felt wrong now. The proceeds would be split according to the original ownership proportions, with a separate accounting for the secondary loan that the Calloways had taken against the property. My lawyer had ensured I wasn't held liable for that debt. It was David's and his parents to sort out between them. There was a section about our joint savings. A section about the car, a section about the furniture which we'd already divided up in a single afternoon by walking through the house with a shared spreadsheet, each of us claiming items without speaking much. At the back was the financial disclosure I'd been waiting for. David had significantly more in his RRSP than I'd known about, a detail that had been conveniently omitted from early discussions and that Patricia had had to formally request twice before it appeared. The equalization of that amount was included in the final settlement. I turned to the last page and read it slowly. I'd gotten what I was owed. I signed where Patricia had flagged with a yellow tab. I set the pen down. I picked up my tea and sat there for a long time, looking out the kitchen window at the backyard, where the garden I'd planted 3 summers ago was still coming up along the fence. Someone else would have that garden. I'd have to start a new one somewhere else. I didn't cry. I'd done most of my crying 6 months ago in my car, in the parking garage at my office, in 15-minute increments between meetings. What I felt sitting at that table was something quieter and harder to name. Not happiness exactly, not even relief. More like the specific stillness that comes when something is finally, after a very long time, stopped. Margaret called that afternoon. She didn't ask how I was doing. She asked if I'd signed. Yes, a pause. David said the terms were fair. Patricia said the terms were fair, I said. That's the one that matters to me. Another pause, longer this time. You know, none of this had to go the way it did, if you'd just been willing to. Margaret, I said it gently, because I wasn't angry anymore. I'd moved through anger and out the other side somewhere around month 8. I don't think this is a conversation I need to have. She said something else. I don't remember what. I thanked her for calling, and I ended the conversation, and I stood in my kitchen for a moment holding the phone, thinking about all the times over 4 years that I'd bitten my tongue in that woman's presence. All the meals I'd made and cleared away. All the weekends I'd spent being a guest in my own home while she rearranged my cupboards and asked me when I was going to start thinking about a family. I put the phone down and went back to looking out at the garden. 2 weeks later, the house went on the market. It sold in 6 days. Oakville real estate moves fast even when the market elsewhere is slow, and the closing date was set for early fall. I'd already found a one-bedroom apartment in Hamilton, close enough to my office and to the friends I'd held onto through all of this. It was smaller than I needed probably, and I loved it immediately. It was mine. The lease was in my name only, and nobody had co-signed anything. On the day the listing went live, Robert called David instead of me, which didn't surprise me. David told me later. We were still in occasional contact, civil and brief. That his father had some opinions about the asking price. That Robert thought we should have listed higher. I thought about Robert and his opinions for approximately 4 seconds, and then I thought about something else. The day I picked up the keys to my apartment was a Saturday in late September. It was one of those clear Ontario fall days where the sky is so blue it looks photoshopped and the air smells like cold coming. I drove there alone, which felt right. I unlocked the door and stood in the empty living room for a minute before I walked through to the window. The view was of the street below, a coffee shop, a maple tree that was just starting to go red at the edges. Nothing spectacular, not a vineyard in Niagara, not a crescent in Oakville. It was exactly enough. I thought about calling my mother. I thought about calling Patricia to thank her again. Instead, I just stood there for a while, quiet, watching the maple tree in the wind. I had wanted a partnership. I'd believed for a long time that if I worked hard enough and stayed patient enough and communicated clearly enough, I'd eventually get one. I'd wanted to be chosen, really chosen, fully, not as an addition to an existing family structure but as someone's actual equal. That's the part that took me the longest to grieve. Not the house, not the savings, not even the years. The thing I kept coming back to, in the parking garage and the counselor's office and the kitchen at 2 in the morning, was that I had wanted so little, really. I'd wanted to be treated like I mattered. And it turned out that was the one thing I couldn't negotiate my way into. What I know now, standing in a small apartment that belongs entirely to me, is that some things can't be argued for in a settlement. Some things you can only go find yourself, somewhere outside the walls of a life that was never quite built to fit you. I set my keys on the windowsill. I went back downstairs to get my boxes.